We are going to talk about managing links and connections. We're first going to talk about the problems or potential problems with links. We'll talk about some solutions or potential solutions to solve those problems or issues. We're going to use MS Query to query another workbook. We're going to edit our links using the Edit Links dialog box, and connections that are similar to links. We're going to manage the connections in the Workbook Connections dialog box. So first, a little brief lecture on links. Links can cause some problems. They seem like a good idea at the time, but they can cause some issues. And the problem with trying to solve these problems with the links is that many times you're linking to a workbook that you don't have within your control. It's somebody else's workbook. If that's the case, some of the solutions that we're going to talk about actually probably don't apply to that circumstance. But the problems with links, if the file that you're linking to is open and the linked file that has the link is closed, and you move the content that's linked to, change the file name and save it, change the location or move the file, change one of the folder names in the directory string, which in effect, from Excel's perspective, is like the equivalent of moving the file, or if you email the file without emailing the linked file, your link is going to fail. You're going to break that link. So possible solutions are: one, don't ever set up a link. If you need to set up a link and the workbooks are within your control, considering building one workbook out of the two workbooks you would otherwise link together. If that solution isn't practical because you'll end up with a workbook that's just too huge and cumbersome, another possible solution, you can set up a workspace. And we did a movie on workspaces. But what that enables you to do is establish an identity for a group of workbooks. And you can use that identity to open up that group of workbooks. So your file and your linked files can all be stored together. Another possibility is to go to the Advanced Option Settings, Alt-FT, Advanced, and go down to the General Options and set up a location that at startup, when you start up Excel, open up Excel, you can have Excel open up all of the files stored in a location that you designate. So if all your linked files are stored in a particular location and they are the only files in that location, this might work as a solution. The problem with this is that every time you open up Excel, you can open up those files at the same time. And that may not be what you always want to do. There is another way to get data out of another workbook into a workbook, and that is to use MS Query, Microsoft Query, to query the workbook you're trying to get data from. To do that, go to Data, left-click from Other Sources in the Get External Data group, left-click from Microsoft Query, and then choose Excel Files. Acknowledge that, left-click OK. And my workbook that I'm after is actually on my desktop, which I can reach by doing that, and it's Workbook 2. I'm going to acknowledge that, left-click OK. You'll get this error message that the data source contains no visible tables. There actually is a table in that workbook. In order to access it, though, you'll have to go to Options and check the box System Tables, left-click OK. And now I see the components of my workbook. Sheet 1, which has column 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Those are actually the columns in my table. And you can use the arrow button to move the selected columns over into the query definition. So this allows you some control over which columns you're actually going to query. I'm going to click Next. This dialog box allows me to establish some filters for each of the different columns. Clicking Next. I can also establish some sorting. Click Next. And I can choose to save the query or not. I'm going to cancel that. So then I can choose to return the data to Microsoft Excel, which is what we're going to do, or view the data or edit query in Microsoft Query. If we choose that, you're going to get a screen that looks a whole lot like Access. So we're not going to go there because this movie is not about Access. I'm going to left-click Finish. And then we get the Import Data dialog box, which should look familiar by now if you've seen the prior movies, where we can import this information coming from this table, this data, as a table, as a pivot table report, has a pivot chart and a pivot table report. We can import it to the existing worksheet or a new worksheet, and then we can also establish some properties, including naming the query, describing what the query is for. The default is to enable background refresh, and we have the option to establish an interval of time as to how frequently the data is going to be refreshed, as well as establishing a background refresh, as well as establishing the refresh when we open up the file. These three options are not mutually exclusive, they're cumulative. I'm going to clear those checkboxes. And then we have some control over the definition of the query. I'm going to left-click OK. We're going to import it as a table. And I get my table of some random numbers between 100 and 200. So if you're trying to get a massive amount of data out of another workbook, and you only need a subset of that data for your purposes, using MS Query might be the way to do it. And like with any connection, you can refresh it manually, or as we just saw, establish an interval of time for which this data will be automatically refreshed. So I created a table using MS Query by querying a workbook that had this exact table and just pulling it into this workbook. But we began this movie talking about links. So I'm going to establish a link by doing a sum on the workbook that actually has the table. Enter. And I did that because before we leave links, there's some functionality in the connections group. The Edit Links button will pull up the Edit Links dialog box. We only have one link. It's the one we just created. We can select the link, update the values, which right now that's not going to change because we didn't change the values in the source. If somebody should move that workbook that we're linked to a new location, we can use this functionality to find and link back to that same workbook that is stored in a new location. I'm going to cancel that. We can open up the source. We can choose to break the link, which I'll do in a second, and we can check the status of the link. The status says the source is open. And those messages you get when you open up a workbook that ask you if you want to update the links, you can control by left-clicking the startup prompt and choose either to have that alert displayed and give the user the option to update the links, to not display the alert and not update the links either, or you can, the third option, not display the alert and automatically update the links. I'm going to cancel that. And I mentioned we can break the link by left-clicking that. And Excel wants to make sure that I'm sure that's what I want to do, so it gives me this message. That's what I want to do. I'm going to break the link, and the link goes away. Notice that my data, the value that was created by the link, remains behind, though. So that's managing the links, editing the links. We can also manage our connections by left-clicking the Connections command in the Connections group. And I have three connections. I have one that I connected to an Access database. We have the MS Query to the Excel file that we just set up. And then I have a connection to a website. We have the option to add a connection because these connections can be exported in the form of an offline database connection file, an ODC file. We can remove connections that we have on our list by left-clicking Remove. We can manage the properties, and we can refresh any of the connections. So that's managing links and connections. We first went over some of the problems, or many of the problems, that you can potentially run into when you establish links. We talked about some solutions for those problems. Among those solutions included using MS Query to query another workbook, which is what we did. We looked at the Edit Links dialog box, where we could manage our links. And we looked at the Workbook Connections dialog box, where we can manage our connections.